Every morning on the seventh floor of the Maduka building felt like a familiar composition. The click of heels echoed rhythmically down quiet hallways. The scent of strong coffee drifted from the automatic machine. Gentle sunlight filtered through frosted glass, illuminating a space built by people who still believed in kindness as a way of doing meaningful work. Salma Hayek stepped into her office like she always did, with her hair tied neatly in a bun and a cream-colored blouse embroidered subtly at the collar. At 48, she moved with the calm elegance of someone who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. Those who worked with her often said Salma didn't have to speak loudly. Her presence carried its own weight. For over a decade, she had been the heart and soul of Maduka, a nonprofit media network dedicated to producing educational television content and training soft skills for immigrant women, underserved youth, and minority communities. She wasn't the CEO. She hadn't founded the organization, yet to donors, partners, and viewers alike, she was its most trusted voice. She was the face of the Women Are More Than Caregivers campaign. The person who had stood on hundreds of stages, telling stories with her warm, grounded voice. Her English carried the softness of her Latin roots, yet every word was deliberate, dignified. She hadn't come to Maduka in search of fame. Years earlier, Salma had been a strategy director at a major media firm in Chicago, but after the sudden loss of her first daughter to a heart condition, she left that career behind. She returned to San Antonio and immersed herself in community projects. That was where she met Gerald Davidson, Maduka's founder, the first person who truly saw what lived beneath her composed surface. You don't need to shout to change something, he once told her. You just need to walk in and look people in the eye, like they're worth being seen. Salma had nodded quietly. She never enjoyed talking about herself, but when the camera turned on, or the room fell silent in front of her, she spoke from the heart. She didn't do media to be known. She did it so others could find their voices. That was why people often called her irreplaceable, at least, those who had worked beside her long enough to understand what she gave. She led training sessions for young editorial teams, wrote scripts for the most impactful social media series, and stayed late to revise dialogue so it could reach older viewers or women in rural areas. She knew exactly what each audience needed to hear and never used hollow words. Sometimes, she would stop in front of the planning board in the meeting room, marker in hand, and rearrange the priorities for the month. Let's move this one back, she would say gently. The women's group near the border just went through a flood. We should send supportive content first. No one ever argued. They knew she had already made phone calls and checked in with those women before making that suggestion. Salma worked as if everyone she served was family. In more than 10 years, she had never taken more than 3 days off in a row, not because she feared being replaced, but because she knew if she wasn't there, someone out there might miss the message they needed to hear to stand back up. Her home, a fourth-floor apartment in San Antonio's historic district, was her quiet sanctuary. A live oak cast shadows on her balcony. She grew basil in small pots, read books on applied philosophy, and sipped chamomile tea late into the night. She had once shared this life with a partner, but that relationship had ended quietly, not from betrayal, but from wounds that refused to heal, even with love and time. She had no children, no flash, no need for attention. Salma lived alone, but she was not lonely. She was the kind of woman who made others feel safe just by being there, but very few ever truly knew her. Only Eliza, her assistant and former mentee, sometimes caught the shift in her eyes like a shadow passing through when something touched an old wound. But Eliza never asked. She understood that some stories didn't need words. They just needed someone to stay close. That spring came late. Unexpected rainstorms had forced the production team to cancel shoots in the mountain regions. Salma didn't complain. She revised the plans, suggested backup filming in the studio, and rewrote dialogue herself to match indoor settings. She no longer chased visual perfection. What she wanted now was for the people on the other side of the screen to feel the message, to know that they weren't being left behind. It was a Monday. No one in the conference room suspected it would be her final day in that chair. Sloane Reeves's voice cut through the silence with the chill of an automated recording. We're at a stage where we need to rejuvenate our communication strategy. Leadership has agreed on a new direction, one led by a younger creative team, more attuned to digital platforms. I believe Salma will support this for the good of the organization. Salma said nothing at first. She looked directly at Sloane, the same woman who, 6 years ago, had been her intern, the same Sloane who once cried alone in a bathroom after being humiliated by a client. Salma had taken the blame for her, quietly taught her again from the ground up, but Sloane had changed. Her hair now dyed a steel gray, her lipstick a deep shade of red, her voice even, her eyes rehearsed. There was no apology, no explanation. The role of creative director will be transferred to Ryan Beck, head of the social content team. Salma will serve as transitional advisor for 2 months before stepping down. Transitional advisor was the polite way of saying, I had been removed. Eliza sat frozen. Ryan avoided my gaze, staring at the table like a child caught cheating on a test. I'm grateful for everything I've learned from you, he mumbled. I'll try to uphold the values you've built. Values. They had just pushed me aside and were now speaking of values. Still, I stood, calmly. I understand. I said, I wish you all the best with your new strategy. I gathered my notebook, my pen, and the faded tote bag that had traveled with me through every community project. No one stopped me. The glass door of the conference room closed behind me, softly, as if nothing had happened. But I knew everything had ended. Betrayal doesn't make a sound. It is an empty chair with no warning, a canceled meeting, an email that no longer includes your name in the CC line. In the days that followed, I still came into the office, but there were no more plans waiting for my approval, no draft scripts sent for my input. They called it transition, but they treated me like a piece of old furniture being moved out to make space. I wasn't angry, just empty. They didn't need to push me. All they had to do was walk past me like I had never been there. One late afternoon, Eliza entered my office looking pale. They just sent the new proposal for the single mother campaign. She said, it's the same script you wrote by hand, the one you hadn't submitted yet. They changed the author to Ryan. I closed my eyes. That script had taken nights to write. I had traveled to the border towns, interviewed a mother who had just escaped an abusive marriage. I had promised her story would be told with the respect she deserved. Now, they had taken the script, removed my name, and launched it online with the headline, A Fresh Take from Our Young Creative Team. The feeling of having your work stolen doesn't always spark rage. Sometimes it feels like grief. Like seeing a family portrait where your face has been cropped out. I left quietly. No farewell posts, no announcement, no thank you party. A few people sent private messages. I'm sorry to see you go. Or, you inspired me more than you know. I smiled. People say those things only when they realize you're about to disappear. I submitted my resignation 2 months early. No one tried to stop me. That evening, I stood outside my apartment door, keys in hand, unable to go inside. The streetlight spilled through the blinds and cast a soft glow on my reflection in the hallway mirror. My eyes weren't red. There were no tears, but something inside me had disappeared, maybe for good. I used to believe that if I lived with integrity, did the right thing, held on to my values, the world would eventually acknowledge it. But maybe the world doesn't run on that kind of logic. The first week after I left, I found myself standing in front of my closet each morning, uncertain about what to wear. There were no meetings to attend, no scripts waiting for review, and no one expecting my feedback. The apartment felt quieter than usual, not because of the silence, but because there was nothing left to fill it. I turned on the television, hoping for something to distract me, but nothing seemed to hold my attention. I opened my laptop, stared at the empty screen for a few moments, and shut it again without typing a word. A question echoed in my mind, soft but relentless. If I was no longer a part of Maduka, then who was I for 12 years? I stood beside women who had been dismissed, neglected, or broken by systems that refused to see their worth. I helped them craft their stories, gave them a voice on stages they never thought they'd stand on, and truly believed, that the work I was doing meant something, not because it paid well, but because it reached people where it mattered most. And yet, it only took 13 minutes in a conference room to erase that version of me. I considered starting over in a new field. An old colleague suggested I take a break, then return to consulting. I smiled politely. But deep inside, I knew I no longer belonged in rooms that measured success by conversion rates and campaign reach. It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. I enrolled in a class on alternative education models. I was the oldest student in the room. The others spoke quickly about virality, algorithms, and emotional engagement metrics. I wanted to ask a different question. Who's going to teach people how to befriend themselves again? But I said nothing. I listened for 3 sessions, then left without saying goodbye. I volunteered to mentor for a public speaking initiative. I thought perhaps that would help me reconnect, but I quickly realized something uncomfortable. Without a title, without a podium, I didn't know how to speak anymore, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had spent too long believing that my voice mattered only when it was attached to a role. One rainy afternoon, I stood on the balcony with a cold cup of tea in my hand. I stared into the gray sky and wondered if everything I had worked so hard for had vanished without leaving a trace. Later that evening, I played a video from the Mother's Hands campaign. In the clip, a woman wiped tears from her face and said, "I used to think I was just a housewife no one cared about, but someone told me that none of us were born to live unseen, that someone was me." I had held her hand, sat beside her in a crowded community center in El Paso, and said those words. Now, I found myself questioning whether I, too, had become invisible. What does it mean to have values if they can be replaced by a memo about refreshing the team? What does trust mean if it fades before you've even packed your desk? One evening, Eliza stopped by. She didn't call ahead. She simply appeared with a box of flan her mother had made. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. I asked, "Are you still at Maduka?" She shook her head. "No, I left 3 weeks after you. I couldn't stay, not after seeing them reuse your words without giving credit. We didn't say anything else. Outside, the streets quieted. Inside, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the soft hum of the hallway light casting gold across the old scarf draped over my chair. That night, I dreamed I stood alone on a stage, no microphone, no audience, just a single, blinding light shining into my eyes, and I couldn't remember what I was supposed to say. I woke up at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat. My heart was racing, but my body remained still. It wasn't the job loss that had undone me. It was the realization that without the spotlight, I no longer knew my worth. 2 months passed in a fog. Days blended into each other, and the silence that once felt heavy now became familiar. Then one morning, without any plan, I woke up early, made a cup of coffee, and sat at my desk. I opened my laptop, not to check emails, but simply to write, not for a pitch, not for a campaign, not for anyone else, just for me. At first, the words came slowly, out of sync, unsure, but after a few mornings, My fingers moved more freely, and I began to recognize the rhythm. It was like my breath returning. I started gathering the old materials I had once poured myself into scripts that had never aired, drafts rejected for being off-timing, outlines of lesson plans that were never used. I opened them one by one, and as I read through those forgotten files, it felt as if I were reading letters from a version of myself I had left behind. But something struck me. I hadn't lost who I was. I had simply been pushed out of the frame. I created a new folder on my desktop and gave it a name, Something True. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it, but I knew that whatever I put in there would not be taken, edited, or stripped of my name. It would stay mine entirely. I began sorting through the materials I had once developed for workshops, training modules, mentor guides, practical sessions on how to listen with empathy. I wasn't rewriting them to reuse. I was reorganizing them because, for the first time in a long while, I felt like I still had something to give. One afternoon, as I was retyping a lesson on active listening, I found myself in tears, not because of sadness, but because after all those months of silence, I realized I was still capable of creating something that mattered, even if no one was paying me for it, even if no one was waiting. That kind of clarity doesn't come with applause. It comes with quiet and with honesty. I stopped looking for new jobs. I stopped trying to prove that I was still young enough to adapt to digital strategies. I no longer needed to justify myself to anyone. Instead, I turned toward smaller spaces, community learning centers for women returning from abroad, evening English classes for working adults who had missed out on formal education. I signed up to teach, not as a guest speaker, just as someone with a marker, a whiteboard, and a few things worth sharing. After my first class, a woman in her 50s, originally from the Philippines, came up to me. She held my hand, looked me in the eye, and said softly, "You make me believe that maybe I deserve a chance." Too, I didn't know what to say. I just held her hand tighter and nodded. In that moment, I understood something I had forgotten. Trust doesn't disappear. Sometimes it just waits for someone to pick it back up again. It was a quiet Saturday morning when the email arrived. The subject line read, "You may not remember me, but I've never forgotten what you did." The name stopped me for a second. Angela Cortez. It took a moment to place her, but when I did, a memory returned sharp and clear. Angela had been one of the participants in the confident speaking program I ran 5 years ago. She was part of a group of women who had just returned to the U.S. after being stranded abroad for years due to immigration complications. Back then, Angela had barely spoken above a whisper. Her eyes avoided every camera. Her voice trembled so much that even the microphone failed to pick her up during her first session. Now, she was the program director at Latinas Rising, a grassroots entrepreneurship initiative supporting women of color starting their own local businesses. In her message, she wrote, "You were the first person who made me feel like my voice was worth hearing." She went on to explain that they were designing a new training program, something different from the usual marketing seminars. What they needed was not a celebrity mentor or a high-profile coach. They needed someone who understood what it meant to start from nothing, someone who had lived it. And then came the invitation. "We're looking for a mentor to lead a training on storytelling and emotional branding for first-time women founders. You're the first person I thought of." I didn't reply right away. Instead, I moved the email into a folder I titled Rare Opportunities, a label I reserved for messages that felt like more than just a job. 3 days later, I met Angela at a cafe tucked inside a quiet neighborhood on the city's east side, far from where most foundations and funders held their events. She spotted me first, standing up. She embraced me like an old friend, her energy steady, her voice confident. She had changed. The soft, hesitant girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had clearly grown into her voice. "You once told me," she said after we sat down, "that you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to speak clearly and mean it." I didn't remember saying that, but when she repeated it, I believed her, because at some point I had been that woman. During our conversation, I told her about the materials I was collecting. I spoke of the folder named Something True, of the pages I was revisiting late at night, of the growing sense that maybe I wasn't finished after all. Angela didn't interrupt. She simply smiled, then slid a thin document across the table. "We need to create a media and communication program," she explained, "but not the kind that teaches people how to go viral. Something more human, more real, a way to help small business owners talk about their work from the inside out." She pointed to the title on the front page, Branding from Within. The curriculum was simple, rough, but it had soul. I flipped through the first few pages and felt a strange warmth return to my hands. Angela leaned forward and said, "You don't need to start over. You just need to come back." That night, back in my apartment, I opened every folder I had neglected. For the first time in months, I wasn't sorting through memories. I was crafting a future. I began stitching together disconnected modules and loose reflections into a single course. Each lesson was rebuilt, not with data points or tactics, but with stories, real ones, things I had seen, things I had survived, things I had helped others survive. There was one chapter I rewrote with particular care. I titled it, The Difference Between Clients and Relationships. A chapter I wish Sloane Reeves had once read. I didn't go back to the language of conversions or impressions. Instead, I returned to the language of trust, the language of durable connection, of promises made and kept, of faith that had once been lost but was now beginning to rebuild itself, word by word. It was a humid afternoon in June when Eliza sent a short text message. "It's happening, just like you said." I replied with one word, what she called me immediately. Her voice was quiet and fast, carrying tension just beneath the surface. Maduka just had its largest sponsor freeze the next quarter's funding. The reason they gave was a decline in content depth. They said the messaging has lost its clarity, its purpose. I didn't speak. Eliza continued. "There's more. A few of the documents you wrote Sloane changed the authorship to Ryan. The funder caught it. They still had archived versions with your name. I closed my eyes. No statement, no scandal, no confrontation, just the truth walking its way back to the surface. Within a week, 3 former colleagues reached out to me independently. They had each been present at an emergency meeting where, for the first time, Sloane had lost composure. She said we need to rebuild credibility before the press finds out. One of them recounted. Another added, apparently, an ex-sponsor told a local outlet that Maduka isn't what it used to be, that it's become unrecognizable. I didn't laugh. I didn't celebrate. I only felt a quiet sadness. Sadness, not because I had lost something, but because what we had once built, brick by honest brick, was unraveling, not from failure, but from carelessness. 2 days later, Angela forwarded me an article. The headline read, "Nonprofit Under Fire for Losing Direction and Misusing Content." My name wasn't mentioned, but there was a section quoting a letter, anonymous, yet unmistakable. I recognized the phrasing, the emotion. It came from someone who had once worked beside me on the Name the Silence campaign. One line stood out, like a wound reopened. True value cannot be rebranded by removing names and pasting over new ones. Trust, once broken, isn't just lost between two people. It collapses across entire communities. I set my phone down. The words weren't mine, but the truth in them was. That evening, I returned to my small classroom to teach the second session of the pilot course for first-time women founders. During a workshop on storytelling, one student raised her hand. "Have you ever had your ideas stolen?" she asked. She was around 27. Her voice was strong, but her eyes carried something guarded, like a person who had already learned not to expect too much. I looked at her and nodded slowly. I once had not just an idea taken, but an entire content system. 10 years worth of work, removed, relabeled, and claimed by someone else. The room fell silent. I didn't sue. I didn't fight publicly. I just rebuilt, quietly, and I let time do the explaining. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't been able to name before. Success doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers until the noise dies down. I didn't need to shout to be remembered. I only needed to keep building what was true. And in time, the difference would speak for itself. The morning I printed the final draft of the training guide, I noticed my hands trembling slightly. It wasn't anxiety. It was the quiet weight of doing something with meaning again. I placed the document on the wooden desk beside my old laptop. Morning light filtered through the curtain, casting a warm glow over the front page. The cover was plain, marked only by a small drawing of an oil lamp. That lamp had become my symbol. I chose it because I believed every person carried their own light, enough to find their way, sometimes enough to light the path for others. Angela arrived early. She brought with her a printed invitation to an upcoming event, a modest gathering of funders and grassroots leaders. The theme was simple but sincere: emotional communication and the renewal of social trust. My name was listed among the speakers, not as a former director, not as a former anything. Just Salma Hayek, founder, OneTrueVoice. I hesitated for a moment, but Angela understood. She leaned in and said softly, "You're not here to speak for recognition. You're here to remind people that integrity still has a voice." The venue was small. Around 60 people filled the room: educators, local organizers, women running neighborhood workshops. There were no banners, no press, just chairs, conversation, and quiet intent. This was my first time speaking in years without a title behind my name. I wasn't representing a company or a campaign. I was just myself. I told a story. I didn't mention names or titles. I didn't present myself as someone wronged. I spoke only of the experience of waking up one day and realizing that your name had been removed from everything you had once created. And then I described the process of starting again, not out of anger, not to reclaim status, but because someone out there might still need to hear something honest. The room listened in silence, not because I shocked them, but because they recognized the truth in what I said. Afterward, 3 people approached me. One represented a small educational center. One worked for a local development fund. The third was someone I didn't expect: Lawrence Bennett, chairman of Maduka's board. He greeted me with a steady handshake and said, "Salma, we didn't just lose your work. We lost the trust people had in us." I didn't respond right away. I waited. He continued, "Sloan will be stepping down by the end of the quarter. We're restructuring, and the board would like to know if you'd consider returning." I looked at him carefully. A dozen feelings passed through me: regret, memory, even a faint sense of justice. But then I shook my head and replied, "I already came back, just not to Maduka. I came back to myself." Lawrence nodded. His disappointment was visible, but so was his understanding. Not everyone should return to where they were, especially when they've already found where they're meant to be. That night, I sent Eliza an email. "I'm signing the lease tomorrow. Just a small space. But it's ours. First trial class begins next week. If you still want to build something with the same values, we'll be here." She replied with a heart emoji. That was enough. By early fall, we opened the first session of OneTrueVoice in a small rented room. It held 3 desks, a whiteboard, and a pot of herbal tea. There were no launch parties, no media, just belief. Our first students were 7 women of different backgrounds: a saleswoman learning to speak from the heart, a retired teacher ready to share her experience with depression, a grandmother opening a home bakery after decades of putting others first. None of them wanted to become influencers. They weren't there to build an audience. They were there to find something real inside themselves. I didn't teach them how to get likes or followers. I taught them how to sit in front of a camera and say something honest, something like, "I used to think I didn't belong, but now I know I do." After 3 months, word began to spread. New participants signed up through friends and neighbors. One nonprofit asked to make OneTrueVoice part of their mentorship program for immigrant women. A startup reached out about co-creating a campaign based on emotional values. They said, "Only you can teach this without making it feel like a performance." I didn't chase these clients. They came on their own. All of them knew me from somewhere, not because I was loud, but because I had been consistent, because I had done the work quietly and with care. When I heard I had already learned the your value doesn't.